Welcome dear students to yet another class on the history of English language and literature. Now we are considering the British history in the early 20th century. In our class today we shall discuss the poetry of the early 20th century. The poetry of the early 20th century. Now the poetry of the early 20th century was quite contrary to the Victorian poetry that we have learned. The poets of the early 20th century were quite skeptical and did not have respect for any established order. They condemned the Victorian ideals as superficial and the Victorian age as hypocritical. Now we shall talk something about the Georgian poetry. The Georgian group of poets were a group of 40 poets who belonged to the early 20th century England, who established themselves during the reign of King George V of the United Kingdom, King George V. There were those who appeared in a series of anthologies called Georgian poetry. Now the term Georgian poetry is used in relation to 5 anthologies of poetry edited by Edward Marsh, published between 1912 and 1922 during the reign of King George V. The Georgian poets gave a lot of attention to the English countryside. They evoked a wistful nostalgia for the familiar traditions of the rural life. Nostalgia is a sentimental longing or wistful affection for a period in the past. So they evoked nostalgia for the traditions of rural life. They are noted for their minute observation of the flora and fauna without any intellectual comment on them. Flora relates to the plant life and fauna relates to the animal life. So, minute observation of flora and fauna without intellectual comment. In the portrayal of human life too, Georgian poetry was anti-intellectual. So, no much of intellectual comment. The Georgian poets wrote poems just before the First World War, during the First World War and immediately after the First World War. Now the important poets of the Georgian poetry are Rupert Brooke, W.H. Davies, Walter de la Mare, and also some other war poets like Siegfried Sassoon, Edmund Blunden, Isaac Rosenberg, Wilfred Owen, etc. So these are some of the Georgian poets. Now as a school of poetry, Georgian poetry had a very short life and fell out of favor after the First World War. So these are a group of poets who did not make any impact in the history of poetry, we can say. Now we shall talk about the war poets. Now the Great War or the First World War of 1914 to 1918 exercised considerable influence on the poetry of the Georgian period. A war poet is a poet who participates in a war and writes poems about their experiences, or they can be poets who have not experienced war but writes poems about war. So these are the war poets. Who is a war poet? Now war poetry consists of 2 groups of poets. Which are these 2 groups of poets? The first group. This first group consisted of those poets who sang the glories of the Great War. They glorified the war. Now they were the older poets and had not gone to fight in the war. They stayed at home without experiencing the devastating horrors of the war. They did not participate in the war. They did not go to fight in the war. They never had a direct experience of the inhuman, devastating atrocities of the war. Naturally, they sang of the glories of the war. According to them, fighting in the war was an act of patriotism, an act of sacrifice, an act of victory. So they glorified the war. The poets of this group are one, Rudyard Kipling. Now he was the prominent of this particular group, Rudyard Kipling. He exhorted his countrymen to be patriotic and to hail the war enthusiastically. Then there is John Freeman. He wrote of optimism and hope during the war. And there are poets like Thomas Hardy, Robert Bridges, Rupert Brooke, John Masefield, Lawrence Binyon, and all these poets talk about the future prospects of the war. Now this group of poets sang the glories of the war They glorified patriotism, they glorified sacrifice, they glorified victory. Now we can critically analyze whether the glorious tribute given by these poets to the war can be justified, or there was unjust glorification of the war, unjust glorification of patriotism, when the war had such devastating, dehumanizing effects on the whole humanity. The second group of poets, war poets, consisted of the younger poets. Now, they had been to the war, they had been to the war front and had witnessed the horrors of the war. Their poems are cynical in nature. They would criticize the war. The second group, cynical about the war, criticize about the war. Now, these poets wrote poems within the war. The poets of this group are the following: the Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, Edmund Blunden, etc. Now these poets wrote on the ravages and horrors of the war which they had experienced personally. They had personally experienced the ravages of the war, and they will write cynically about the war. Now Siegfried Sassoon, he was the first soldier poet who would reveal the terrors or the terrible realities of the war. He would advise people to stop war. Some of the war poems of Sassoon are Suicide in the Trenches, Memory, The Hero, etc. Then there is Robert Graves. He was horrified by the devastation of the war. He would talk about the beastliness and the spiritual aridity caused by the war. Wilfred Owen is the greatest of the war poets. Wilfred Owen would realistically portray the grim reality of the war. He would write about the hopelessness, futility, and the horror and pity of the war. His own words are, "I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war." So he would write about the hopelessness and the pity of the war. The poems of Owen would depict so well the pity of the war. He really feels the pity of the war and is using his poetic skills to powerfully present the pity of the war in all his poems. Now there is Edmund Blunden. Edmund Blunden, though he belongs to the second group of poets who directly witnessed the atrocities of the war, he does not present the ugliness of the war as forcefully as other fellow poets. Now there is Isaac Rosenberg. His poems from the trenches. His poems from the trenches are recognized as some of the most outstanding poetry written during the First World War. August 1914, Break of Day in the Trenches, Dead Man's Dump, Marching on Receiving News of the War, Through These Pale and Cold Days, etc. So thus we have two types of war poems. The first type, the laudatory verses, verses praising the war of the elder poets who stayed at home. They glorified and justified war and patriotism. There is a second type, the cynical poems of the younger poets who had been to the war front and had witnessed the horrors, the devastating effects of the war. They would criticize the war and would negatively present the war. So my dear students, the war poetry helped to prepare the way for a change. The disillusionment that grew after the war contributed to the emergence of modernism, and we will discuss about modernism and the modern poets in our next lecture. So my dear students, we are coming to the end of this short lecture, and in this lecture we have given a short description about the poets or the poems of the early 20th century. We talked about the Georgian poetry. We also talked about the war poets. The war poets can be categorized into two types. The first one, the older poets who will sing of the glories of the war, who will sing of the glories of patriotism, glorifying the war. And there is a second group of poets who had been to the war front, who had witnessed the horrifying, devastating effects of the war. And these younger poets who had witnessed the war, they would write poems criticizing the war. For your assignment, please write a short description, short summary of our lecture today, the poets of the early 20th century. Please write something about the Georgian poetry, and please write something about the war poets, the two groups of war poets, the older poets who will sing of the glories of the war, and the younger poets who would criticize the war. Thank you for your patient listening. Please stay safe at home. Have a nice time.